There's a wonderful moment in the biscuit factory where you describe the quality control process, and there are two women, and you'd say they're almost like they're playing drafts as they watch these pieces, which are biscuits, flying in front of their eyes. But the most inspiriting thing about that is the fact that they're having a conversation, and somehow normal human interchange is going on between them, even though the process of their job is actually rather dull and over-specialised and boring.
There's ultimately probably no such thing as a totally boring job, because we bring to our jobs the whole of ourselves. And what's fascinating about looking at even quite dull, supposedly dull jobs, call centres, factory production lines, warehousing, etc., is how much life there is in these places, and how much humour, black humour may be, but real social interaction. And I think that, when people lament unemployment and home working, really what unemployment and home working remind us is just how much it's the social aspect of work that makes work meaningful.
Expectation is another key concept in the book. You talk about how before the modern age, really, we didn't really have much expectation of getting satisfaction from paid employment. They were almost like opposites. And yet now we have very high expectation of self-fulfillment from work. And when you go to embed yourself with an accountancy firm, there's a sort of juxtaposition there between, I suppose, your expectations of fulfillment as a writer versus their expectations, and you compare them, I think, to taxi drivers. They do their job, they turn up there for hire, and it's done, and they're on to something else. And I wonder if you'd say a little bit about that, because those expectations can obviously be productive of both the joys and the miseries of work.
Well, I was struck really by a very basic difference that exists between people. There are certain people who want their work to add up to something that you can see, hold, touch at the end of the day. They want their efforts to be directed towards something very tangible. And then there are others who are much happier just to enjoy the process, and they don't mind if there's not an end product. We were saying taxi drivers, but also accountants. I went to spend time with this firm, and they were on the whole a much happier bunch than writers. And one of the themes is I do often contrast my own choices with the choices of the people I meet. And I found that these accountants were able, in a way, to tolerate the fact that they would just be employed on a certain project for a month or 6 months or something, and then they would leave that project, nothing would be left of it, and yet that was okay for them. It was an almost kind of Buddhist renunciation of the ego. They were prepared to not put themselves right at the centre of their work. And, as I say, writers at the other end of the spectrum, a miserable bunch who are constantly thinking, me, and that probably is a way to unhappiness. So I was struck by that.
You meet and talk to a painter who specialises in painting one particular tree at all different times of the year and in different lighting conditions. Was he the most fulfilled person that you found? I mean, he was one of probably the least remunerated, but was he, would you say, a fulfilled worker?
I wanted to look at an artist, because that's in a way the area that I come from, but I didn't want to look at a writer. So I found this guy who's really quite extraordinary. As you say, he does paint the same tree in a field in Essex, and he's very much driven by almost a kind of calling to do this, and he suffers for his work in a way that others don't necessarily in this book. He fascinated me because he really was an example of someone who's doing something because he's almost got a sort of itch, as it were. He's got to get something done. And it pushes aside all sorts of other quite sensible considerations for status, prestige, money, etc. So he's not aware of his choice as a sacrifice as such, but I think it is. And as a parent, for example, one couldn't help but feel, I hope my child doesn't have that sort of itch, in a way, because it's wonderful, it's noble, etc., but it comes at such a high price.
I really liked what you had to say about the erotics of the workplace, which you compare to a monastic order or something like that in a pre-modern world.
Yeah, I mean, we very much pride ourselves on how relaxed we all are about sex. That's very much something that the modern world likes to do, and we contrast ourselves with Victorians and giggle at their prudish aspects. But you only have to look at a company manual about sort of employee rules to realise that there's still quite a lot of prudishness. And I spent time in this large accountancy firm that had rules against any kind of contact with another co-worker, and the punishments were draconian, leading up to being fired for any infringement of this. And it struck me that this is characteristic of the modern world of work, this kind of taboo about sex. And I think that the taboo is there really for one reason, which is to repress the thought that it might be more fun to have sex than to work. So the modern corporation is a jealous animal. It reminded me of the church in the Middle Ages that was similarly jealous. It wanted people to think about God. And so sex was competing with thoughts of God, and that's why it had to be repressed. So repression of the sexual impulse seems to be a feature both of the modern office and the medieval monastery. But of course, in the nature of these things, when you repress something, it also comes back with a extra force. So there's a sort of hidden erotics of the workplace, as indeed there was a hidden erotics of the monastery and the nunnery.
I wanted to ask you finally, Alain, if having researched and written this book, your own sympathies were enlarged perhaps towards groups of people or professions that you hadn't felt sympathy before, and how it had sort of changed you and your attitude to work.
I think it's helped me to connect much more with industrial civilization, if you like, that's all around us. And I think that, as I say, the writerly caste is a little bit stuck in its own ivory tower. I understand the world of publishing very well, but I never really understood fully the world of logistics or accountancy or whatever. So I think it's a feature of the modern world that we don't know enough about what other people do. And it was writing the book was a terrific chance just to be nosy about other people's jobs. And I think it's one of the most interesting things you can do. We do tend to ask each other what we do for a living very early on in a conversation, but often we're not allowed to probe too deeply for fear of seeming nosy or whatever. But to know what somebody does at 3:00 in the afternoon and how their day is structured is absolutely fascinating. So trying to turn the world of work into an arena that could be fascinating, just as fascinating as a love story, that was my goal in the book.